Nostalgia Trip, Parts 4 and 5 by Icydice.
Alright. First things first. My mother confronted me earlier. She had some questions regarding what reminded me of Mr. O. She found it peculiar. I had remembered a person I hadn't spoken of for years, but she initially forgot to ask me about it due to her fatigue after a long day at work. I told her about the drawing I found in the cardboard box. I neglected to mention that he was omnipresent within the game, however. I'm not exactly sure why I omitted that information. It was as if the mere thought of doing so cultivated a strong reaction deep inside my gut. The best way I can describe it is the sensation that washes over us when we do something we aren't supposed to as a kid, such as sticking our fingers into the cookie jar. She accepted my explanation, yet she seemed wary about the whole thing. She continually asked me what I remembered about Mr. O, but I repeatedly told her I remembered nothing about him, reminding her that I was the one who asked her about Mr. O first, signifying my lack of knowledge on the subject. She nodded her head in agreement. She's been acting very strangely in regards to this entire situation. I inquired about her odd reaction to Mr. O, and she simply shook her head and chuckled to herself. Her laugh wasn't very convincing. The usual energy in her eyes appeared drained, and subtle rings circled them. It was clear to me that she hadn't been sleeping well. According to her, it had been deflating listening to me constantly ramble about my imaginary friend. She smirked slightly and expressed disapproval of me mentioning him at all, remarking that it might be best to forget about him altogether. Ironic, considering she was the one who brought him up this time. Her smile was, once again, not convincing in the slightest. To the commenter on my last post, I'm greatly sorry that you also live in a single-parent household. I understand all too well how difficult that can be. On the flip side, I'm glad my post can connect with people in a way that they can relate to. It evokes a kind of communal feeling, don't you think? No worries about asking what happened to my father, by the way. I'm more than comfortable divulging that information. My father passed away when I was very young. I had no concept of death or loss at that time, so from my perspective, he was just there one day and gone the next. He had taken his own life, but I couldn't quite grasp the gravity of the situation back then. I recall seeing my mother look utterly devastated each day. Sometimes, I could even hear her weeping at night, alone in her bedroom. Even if I couldn't fully understand what was happening, I knew something was wrong. I would try and comfort my mother, embracing her every time she appeared to be upset. She appreciated my efforts, I'm sure of it. Even today, the feeling of her returning my hug and fruitlessly trying to suppress her tears is one I can recollect vividly. There are some other things I would like to cover in this entry. I know I said I would explore the game further today, but I've decided against it. I apologize, but you see, I dreamt of him last night. Mr. O appeared in my dream, his formidable stature casting a dark shadow over my petite frame. I looked up at him, arching my neck to view his face. His grin was as wide as could be, as he stared down at me. His eyes seemingly bulged out from his sockets, the veins surrounding them protruding through his skin. He methodically set one foot in front of the other, approaching me. Instead of backing away, I inexplicably reciprocated his advancement. When I was close enough for him to reach out and grab me, he did just that. He firmly gripped my arm, pulling me closer to him. At that moment, I realized a strong sense of raw terror was brewing within me. I finally snapped out of my daze and began to struggle. As I squirmed and attempted to wriggle free of his grasp, he only clenched my arm tighter. I began grunting as panic set in. I could feel the adrenaline coursing through my veins as I struggled to free myself from his grip. All the while, he kept his eyes on me, his glare seemingly burning into my soul. I only paused when I felt his palm violently strike my cheek. I stood motionless as he bent down and positioned his face directly in front of me. He maintained that signature shit-eating grin, even while his tongue slid out from his parted lips. I helplessly observed as he licked his lips, and at that very moment, my eyes met with his. In them, I saw pure, unadulterated hunger. He then proceeded to speak to me. He didn't say much, only uttering a single sentence while keeping his sights directly on me. "Jeremy, I love you, Jeremy. I will always love you, Jeremy." He stopped, and his grin grew impossibly wide. As his lips curled past his ears, the skin around his mouth tore open and a sickening crack could be heard whilst his jaw adjusted to his new, deformed smile. He repeated those words to me again, and again, and again. As he repeated those words, no longer did they only originate from him, they echoed throughout the room surrounding us. He began slowly pulling me towards his gaping maw. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. I could only watch in horror as this man lifted my tiny body off the ground, bringing me closer and closer to his mouth. I caught a final glimpse of his eyes. The hunger they contained had grown exponentially. Those wide eyes full of childlike, giddy excitement were the last things I saw before I was enveloped by complete darkness. No longer did I try to free myself from my predicament. I just sat there, waiting for it all to be over as Mr. O consumed me whole. "Jeremy, I love you, Jeremy. I will always love you, Jeremy." The words no longer echoed throughout the room. Instead, they bounced around inside my mind. The darkness was so complete that I couldn't even see my hands, but I could feel them. I felt them tugging at my hair and digging into my scalp. I was doing all that I could to distract myself from the repetitive, monotonous voice within my head. It only grew louder. As I rejected it, the voice grew more frustrated. The words that it spoke sounded like they were said through the gritted teeth of an angry, impatient man. I begged for it to stop. I cried out into the darkness, my voice quivering. I told it that I would do anything it wanted if it would only stop. Then, it ceased altogether. I sat there in silence, alone in whatever dark pit contained me. The sound of footsteps gradually approached. There was a presence behind me, but I didn't dare turn my head around. Someone placed their large hand on my shoulder, gently caressing it. The owner of that hand spoke. "If you ever want something, all you have to do is ask," said the voice. He leaned forward and positioned his lips near my ear. "Remember, Jeremy, I love you." It was then that I launched upright in bed, my forehead drenched in sweat. My breathing had taken the form of short gasps for air. Looking down, I even noticed that my palms tightly gripped the sheets. I didn't sleep a wink after that. Rather, I paced the perimeter of my room thinking about what the hell just happened. Needless to say, if the game is causing me to have graphic nightmares, it's probably best that I take a break from it. This is especially true if it interrupts my sleep schedule. I don't have time to take naps during the daytime, so yeah, sorry about this, there won't be any game updates today. However, that isn't to say I didn't explore the rest of the DS. There's still a plethora of other applications to go through, and I'm intrigued by quite a few of them. I essentially held a time capsule in my fingertips, and I was not going to waste that opportunity. The application that sparked my interest the most was the camera. I wondered what kind of photos I took back then. I clicked on the camera icon, and I was brought to a gallery of images. A lot of the photos were a blurry, unfocused jumble of pixels. I suppose my photography skills as a kid weren't quite as developed as they could have been. Other pictures contained various items, like my backpack or my Hot Wheels race car track. I scrolled through more of the images. Photos of trees, schoolyard equipment, and awkward selfies littered the camera roll. Of course, most of these photos were nonsensical, but that was a part of the magic of it all. It was relieving to take a break from my organized world and revisit one where nothing really mattered. There were a few photos that sparked my interest more than the rest. They were photos of me. I didn't recognize the background of the images. The walls behind me were blank, coated with white paint. I wasn't smiling at any of the photos. I stood against the wall, looking. I was looking upward. The camera had been angled downward to take my picture. The position the photographer assumed was several feet above my head, meaning no child could have taken those images. As I scrolled further through the camera roll, I realized my face had begun to warp into that of an unsettled child. In some of the photos, I even noticed that my cheeks had been faintly colored red. It was as if I was crying before the photo was taken, There were no photos in the camera roll following that. I'm at a loss for words at this point. I don't know where those photos were taken, nor do I know who took them in the first place. How is it that I could exactly pinpoint the locations of the images on the black camera, yet not recall the context of the pictures I just viewed? It just doesn't make sense to me. There has to be a reasonable explanation for it. Maybe I was at an aunt or uncle's house and they took those photos? Then why did I appear to be as upset as I was? Do you remember the feeling I described to you all earlier? The one I experienced at the thought of telling my mother about Mr. O being inside of my game? The same feeling arose when I thought about asking her about those photos. It was that same sinking feeling in my gut. I need an explanation, but it's as if I can't bring myself to seek one from her. Still, it isn't like there are many other sources to find one. There haven't been any responses to my forum thread. I know it hasn't been that long since I uploaded it, but I'm growing impatient nonetheless. This Mr. O guy is invading my dreams. He's invading my memorabilia. Why is he everywhere? I'm not a particularly superstitious person. Sure, I believe there may be something out there that can't be explained by our natural world. But at this point, I don't know how to explain all of this. This imaginary friend of mine doesn't seem quite as imaginary as I first understood him to be. I know that sounds crazy, but I can't think of many alternative explanations. I'll keep you guys updated. Thank you for your time. I'd like to clarify something I said in my last blog entry. To be honest with you all, I've been operating off of very little sleep and my workload has been stacking up. That happening in conjunction with the recent occurrences I've described has been weighing down my mental state. With this in mind, please take my claims regarding paranormal activity with a grain of salt. A mix of stress and confusion left me grasping for any possible explanation for what I've gone through. It's entirely irrational to fill in the gaps of my knowledge with random conclusions. I hope you all understand my thought process concerning the theory I typed down earlier. For now, I should remain agnostic until I find more evidence to support a logically sound conclusion. That being said, it seems like the only way to gather more evidence is to continue playing the game. My forum post still has not garnered any responses, the web results for keywords Township Village still produces 0 relevant results. It looks like I'm the only person who's even aware of this game, and exploring the rest of the DS, aside from the camera roll of course, yielded no useful information. I know I said I would take a break from the game for a while. While I predicted putting my gameplay on hiatus for a bit longer, I can't just push it off anymore. It's becoming increasingly difficult not to think about Mr. O. His image has been branded into my mind ever since he entered my dreams. I can only hope that exploring the rest of the game world will bring me some form of closure. Maybe then I'll be able to repress my ever-growing anxiety. My schoolwork can wait. For now, I need to allocate as much time and energy towards playing the game as possible. I'll return to this entry later today after I finish with my game session. Nostalgia Trip was written by Icydice. Narration, editing, mastering, and original music by Abysme. Comprehensive links below. YouTube.com/Creepypasta is a collaborative channel. Please, subscribe if you want to follow our content. If you want to support the channel, please consider liking, commenting, and sharing this video with like-minded members of the community.